Hi, this is Zach with Worn & Wound, and today I'll be taking a look at the Laurier Falcon. Laurier is a brand you might be familiar with if you've been reading Worn & Wound. They came out with their Neptune dive watch within the last year. It was a very successful launch for the brand, and since then they followed up with two new series of watches, another bezeled diver, and then this watch called the Falcon, which is a bit of a departure. But like many other brands are kind of doing right now, which is very smart, they're taking a modular approach to their design and utilizing some elements in each watch. So the mid case is the same, they have some same hands. There's a general, like an overall aesthetic feeling that's similar between the three. But in this case, they removed the rotating bezel and went for a fixed bezel for, what is a very different overall look and, what is clearly then like a non-diver sort of watch. So the idea behind the Falcon, though, and I mean, all the Laurier watches have this kind of mid-century design ethos behind them, at least for their current watches. And for the Falcon, they really wanted to celebrate those kind of classic explorers and sports watches from the mid-century. Things like, the old Smith's watches and the old Rolex, kind of pre-explorer watches, the watches that famously went up, Everest with Sir Edmund Hillary, which were at the time these very small petite watches that by today's standards would absolutely be considered dress watches. In fact, they are, the vintage ones are worn as dress watches, but at the time were these awesome kind of rugged watches that were meant to be put to the test. So the Falcon celebrates that watch specifically by being, a nice kind of robust watch design with a 200-meter water resistance, just like their dive watches, screw-down crown, but it's smaller than, I'd say what watches were a few years ago, at this point becoming sort of a standard. It's 39 millimeters. And then it has this one real signature detail, which is something I'm super happy to see, and I think really makes the watch, which is the waffle dial, which I'll get into in a moment. So yeah, just looking at the case now, it's a 39 millimeter diameter. It is 48 millimeters lug to lug. 12 millimeters thick, a little bit thicker if you include the plexiglass crystal here, 20 millimeter taper, 20 millimeter lug, and drilled lugs and a massive, massive crown, which is just kind of part of the line between the three watches they initially have, the Neptune, the Hydra, and the Falcon. When you look at this watch, just looking at the case, I don't really get an overly vintage feeling. You get it much more so from their dive watches because the dive bezels had the certain look. This one just feels like a moderately sized modern watch to me, but then has some vintage aesthetic cues that just kind of make it a more aesthetically and stylish watch that speaks to certain mid-century aesthetics that I think are very popular right now that we really like, especially on the bracelet, which we'll get to also in a second. So looking now at the dial, the dial on this watch is really fantastic. There's three different colors. It comes in black, white, and hunter green. They used kind of a faux gilt aesthetic here to make it kind of pop. So you have applied markers with gilt or gold, PVD edges, lume filled. You have brushed gold hands. You have gold printing. You have gold minute track. And then you have, on this version, this hunter green dial with this great waffle pattern. And it's such a simple thing to do, add a pattern like this to the dial, and it was so beautiful and so coveted in these mid-century watches that it's kind of bizarre that it's not something you see more. Maybe it's starting now. We're going to see more from here on. But I really, have to give kudos to Laurier for embracing that detail and going with it, because it's a very simple thing that just, makes a huge difference with the watch. Light does not break across the dial in a way you're used to or you see on a million watches. It has this nice little texture to it. It's a nice departure from the sunray dials and matte dials and things you just see all the time. And then in this case with the gold and the green, I think they did a really nice color combination. It's just very appealing looking. Obviously this is also a super legible watch. You have these massive markers. They're not wide, but they're very long. They almost reach the middle of the dial, which I think has a nice effect. It kind of brings the eye towards the center. It also lines up well with these hands, which are very stylized hands with a broad arrow hour hand. I really like that they went with brushed gold for those rather than a polished gold. I think that just subdues it a little bit. And then they have a date window at 6. Obviously, date windows can be a pretty contentious thing. We've seen many in the past that did not succeed. This one is very well executed, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's at 6, which I personally always like. If it works with the dial, it keeps the symmetry, it feels like it's in the right position. It's less jarring than when there's like a kind of an opening at 3, or if it's stuck 4.5, something like that. I mean, it's a case-by-case situation sort of a thing. Here, it definitely works. But then the window itself is not square. It's a sort of a keystone shape, which I've seen on a bunch of watches, notably, in my opinion, actually something like the Universal Geneves from the 1950s, which actually were at 3. But the reason why it works so well is because those lines are sort of pointing more towards the center. So rather than being parallel essentially to nothing, they are kind of more organically part of the dial, which just creates a much nicer flow. And I think it's just one of those smart details that a lot more people should really pay attention to. And then it has a slight gold rim. So rather than being kind of a heavy applique window, which I think can sometimes be distracting, or no window at all, where it feels kind of just like the dial had a hole punched through it, they add just that little bit of gold there. It makes the date pop, makes it look intentional, and it's just a well-executed detail. Moving on from the dial, which, as you can tell, I'm quite a fan of, you have the bracelet. Now, this bracelet is the same bracelet that was on their previous dive watches, and there's a reason why they're using it again. It is hands down one of the nicest bracelets we've seen in the last year or so, particularly from a very affordable watch. So some of the reasons why it's so nice is that, once again, this had this mid-century sort of flair to it, so it has a very flat surface on top. So if you look at, vintage Omegas, for example, you'll see that. And then if you look at reissued Omegas that are trying to look vintage, you'll see that again. It has a very nice look to it. It creates a really nice reflection. But then additionally, there's a lot of little kind of engineering details that you have to get right on a bracelet. And what they did was they fully articulated the bracelet. So these middle links move apart from the outer links. So as you can see here on my wrist where it's kind of flexing, you have a nicer bend, which makes it very comfortable. It just looked really, really, I think, well executed, like a much higher end bracelet than this watch might suggest it would have, because it's not an expensive watch. You also have a small clasp, which is nice, very easy to open, very easy to close. There's no dive extension there, but this isn't a dive watch. I find this nice because there's nothing clunky about it, nothing bulky, and it's nicely finished as well. One other detail I really like, this has single-sided screws, so it's a very easy bracelet to change the link on yourself at home with just a screwdriver. Another actually important kind of vintage aesthetic to this element is that it has a 4mm taper, which does have kind of a big impact, I think, as well, especially in comfort. I'm not actually a huge bracelet person, and that's largely because I find them uncomfortable after long periods of time. But these new vintage bracelets, vintage style bracelets, something we saw on like the Oris Diver 65 or some of the Tudors that have a much larger taper, are much more comfortable, at least for me, especially on the underside of my wrist when you see that flex there. So I think they did a great job. Other great details of this watch, very well finished. Very nice brushing on the bezel. There's a nice clean bevel going around that's polished. Just very well executed overall. And I feel like I'm saying that there's something surprising about that, but what this also comes down to is that this watch, like I said, is very affordable. So this watch is $399. It's powered by a Seiko NH35A automatic movement. So nice workhorse movement, something that is reliable. And I think the pricing on this really just makes it a really kind of tempting watch, They really kind of nailed a lot of sweet spots here. They got a really good aesthetic, a really comfortable watch. And then at the price point of $399, it's not breaking the bank. Obviously, it's not nothing, but I think they kind of found a sweet spot for good vintage style tool watch that you can really actually wear. So if you're looking for something with a mid-century style, but kind of a modern sporty build and some really, really nice elements, you definitely should check out the Laurier Falcon.